First of all, I want to say thanks to Bill and to the board of BostonCHI for inviting me here. It's a real honor to help close out the year. This is a wonderful organization. I'm glad to be a small part of it. So tonight, I'd like to tell you guys, because I've been up on stage for just a few seconds, I feel like I can trust you. My name is Ethan Marcotte. I'm Beep. I'm a tweeter. And I am an incredibly, impossibly lazy person. But I'll get to that in a minute. Because what I'd like to do tonight is actually start with a story about a tree. Now, this tree is actually a very special tree. It's located in the heart of Pando Forest, which, if you happen to know, it's in Utah near the Fish Lake National Reserve. And it's a fairly good-sized forest. It's some 106 acres in size, and it's also incredibly beautiful. And it has all these wonderful white trunks that are just sprouting up out of the ground around us as you and I are looking for this one very special tree. But the thing is I've actually lied to you, because Pando isn't a forest. Pando is actually one tree. See, Pando is actually the Latin term for I spread, and it's what's known as a clonal colony. It's one single giant quaking aspen tree. So each tree, each trunk that you and I see with our eyes is actually just one stem, all sprouting up of this one massive underground root system that they all share. And there are some 40,000 stems in Pando. Now, there's some debate as to how old Pando actually is. Most scientists seem to agree that it's around 80,000 years in age, although there are some that say its age is actually closer to 1 million years. But regardless of where you actually happen to fall on either side of the debate, Pando is both the largest and the oldest organism on the planet today. This is a talk about web design, I promise you. But the reason I love this is because I think in recent years, now especially in the rise of mobile, we've started to see web design's forest for its trees. Because we used to talk about our interfaces and our designs as some sort of holistic, tightly bound thing. And I think we're beginning to realize now more than ever that our work starts a level below that. I had a friend and colleague, Trent Walton, once write about his transition from kind of a responsive design skeptic into somebody who I'd argue is actually producing some of the most beautiful responsive design work out there. And he talked about how he traded the control he had in Photoshop for a new kind of control. And I like that he doesn't say less control. It's just different. One in which he could use flexible grids, flexible images, and media queries to build not a page, but a network of content that can be rearranged at any screen size to best convey a message. And I think there's something really kind of beautiful about that. Because we've always thought about our work in terms of pages, in terms of creating these abstract systems of columns and rows, and thinking about how we then fill them with information. And instead, as we're designing for more devices and more screen sizes, more form factors than ever before, we're starting to understand that we are designing these networks of content, these individual pieces of our design that then can be rearranged to convey a message, to tell a story on different size screens. And I got to tell you, it's really weird to be the guy talking about responsive design, because I wrote this article, right, just a couple years ago, and I wasn't expecting anything like the reception that it got, where designers and publications and brands and companies that I deeply respect and admire took the really simple formula in the responsive design article and have done things with them that are frankly kind of breathtaking. And as they do so, they're experimenting with the flexibility at the heart of web design to do these beautiful responsive layouts. But at the heart of every single one of them, they're not thinking about these design systems in terms of pages and thinking about how they need to reformat these grids at different size points. They're starting by designing those smallest, most discrete parts of their interfaces, and then using those individual bits to build these more complex layout systems, these more responsive layout systems up from there. But here's the thing, guys. I think it's safe to say that we have a fairly tough job day to day. You know, I mean, it's not as tough as most industries, right? But I think we have our fair share of challenges. I love showing up for work, but there's some things I still shake my fist at. Yeah, okay, some nods in the back of the room, right? I mean, because, it's usually brought about by these little guys, right? That's all right, there's gonna be, hugs and dessert afterwards. It's gonna be a healing night for all of us. But it's not just about individual device classes, right? I mean, we are today designing for more operating systems than at any other point in the web's very short history. We're dealing with devices that can't be neatly categorized into touch-based interfaces or analog interfaces, but some of them actually marry the two of them really effectively and well in kind of a hybrid display. We're dealing with displays of varying color density and degree. In other words, we're at this point right now where the words that we use to refer to these devices most broadly, tablet and mobile, are so broad and so inexact as to be completely unhelpful in addressing the specific design and interface challenges we're dealing with on a daily basis. And I suppose Google Glass is probably in there somewhere too. I'm a big fan of the platform. But I mean, the challenges just kind of keep compounding themselves, right? I mean, we're dealing with new interaction models and new device classes and browsing contexts that seem to show up week after week, month after month, things we weren't previously aware of. Hardware and software vendors are actually interacting with and inventing new interaction models that we and our interfaces online actually now have to sort of intuit and take advantage of. And with Apple's keynote yesterday, we saw a couple more sort of show up as well. And the network that we use, not just to travel the web, but also to publish our information, to make our interfaces and services available, is far more broadly accessed today. But it's also far more volatile and far less reliable than we might like to think about when we're talking about the quality of our designs. So I got to be honest with you guys. Again, there's some trust building up here. I got to tell you, it would be really nice for me to sort of stand up here and say that I can look at all these new devices that are hitting the marketplace, or these new interaction challenges, or the fragility of the network, and say that I always have a perfect answer crafted for every single one of them, that I can rise to the occasion. But more often than not, my reaction is one of laziness. I get more than a little bit negative. I get more than a little bit sleepy. And most days, frankly, I kind of want to just go directly back to bed. Thing about laziness, it's kind of an interesting word, because we use a lot of language on our daily work to talk to each other, to talk about the quality of our work. You know, I could be talking to you and talking about a friend of ours, and maybe I could say that she is liberal or conservative, or logical or incredibly a dreamer. And depending on who you are and the values you happen to hold dear, either one of those words and each one of those pairs could be seen as a compliment or a complaint. Laziness does not have this problem. Everyone just kind of universally agrees this is a terrible thing, right? I mean, laziness prevents you from delivering better work, from being a better person, from achieving something better than your current state. I'm here to suggest tonight, however, that maybe the picture's a little bit more complicated than that. There's this quote that I love by Hugh Prather, who said that our anxiety does not come from thinking about the future, but from wanting to control it. And I know, at least for me, especially in the wake of Apple's keynote yesterday, like, that's definitely true. I sort of see these new inventions and these new innovations and feel like I have to have a perfectly crafted solution ready at hand for every single one of them. And not only is that tiring, it doesn't really scale. So I'm here tonight to suggest that maybe a little bit of laziness applied intelligently to digital design, or more specifically to responsive design, can actually be a saving grace in some of the challenges we're facing today and for some of the challenges that we're actually going to be facing in the next couple years. So if we can let go even just a little bit, maybe we can actually, in the long run, do considerably more for our interfaces and for our users. So this talk tonight, at least, is kind of a rambling meditation on how I've been seeing laziness manifest itself in my practice over the last couple years, and specifically around some key ingredients of different responsive designs that I've worked on. And maybe afterwards, over dessert, as we're about to go out into the stormy night, we could actually have a little bit of a discussion about how you guys work and whether or not I'm just sort of a silly person talking about laziness. So let's start right up the top with layout. I do a lot of layout in my responsive design practice, and I've been seeing laziness kind of manifest itself in a couple different areas, specifically with video and embedded media in responsive designs, and then with the larger layout systems that house the content that I'm actually designing. So video is kind of interesting, because there's been a significant amount of writing done about how we can get flexible images working in layouts that don't have any kind of ideal shape. One single line of CSS, and if you don't know CSS, that's great. It's relatively new to me. But basically, this one rule says images have a maximum width of 100% of their container. A really great example of this is ediblevineyard.com. This is a local site, features a lot of really great restaurants and cuisine from the Massachusetts Cape, and it's a beautifully designed responsive layout. And they have all this wonderful food photography. And you'll notice that as the flexible responsive layout is changing its shape, the image never exceeds the width of the container that it's sitting within. Its maximum width is 100%. Now, the nice thing about this rule is that it actually extends to other kinds of media as well, like embedded objects and video. So here's kind of a random example from my blog, which is neither attractive nor responsive. shoemaker's children and all that. And you'll notice, though, that this flexible layout, however, the video never exceeds the width of its containing element. Its width is never greater than 100% of the column that it sits in. And I've just realized this video is kind of terrifying without sound, so I apologize for that. Enjoy your nightmares this evening, from me to you. Now, this is obviously, from a layout standpoint, not ideal, right? Because the width of the video has remained flexible, but the height has remained static. This is kind of a problem of scale, because most media that gets embedded in our pages doesn't actually have any intrinsic dimensions. In our HTML and the documents that we're using to describe our content, we actually have to specify them in pixels. And we can easily override those dimensions, or the width specifically, in CSS, but we can't do the same with CSS for the height. If we said something like height auto, we'd have a whole bunch of videos that would collapse to being 0 pixels tall, and darn it, the internet needs its cat videos. So there's been a lot of people sort of experimenting with solutions for this in responsive design specifically. This is made by hand.com. This is a beautiful responsive site. I highly recommend checking it out, even if you're not into responsive design specifically. It's a short film series in this wonderful responsive design. And since it is responsive, you can basically view these videos regardless of the size of your browser window. And what they're doing is they're using a little bit of JavaScript to actually measure the dimensions of the video when the page first loads. And then anytime the design reshapes itself, if you either resize your browser window or you change the orientation of your device, it's going to resize the video based on that initial measurement. This is an old version of the Do Lectures site. It's an online conference library. And they took a similar approach, a little bit of JavaScript to resize the video proportionally. But you're going to notice in both of these layouts there's a little bit of a visual stutter, where it takes the video a second to actually catch up to the layout as it resizes. Now, partially this is because in JavaScript it's actually really expensive to do this math that frequently, so they have to actually sort of throttle it a little bit, so it runs less often. But this also kind of points to the fact that maybe this extra layer of technology is not ideal. Maybe we need a more native way to manage these layouts intrinsically. Well, thankfully, this is actually kind of a solved problem, because back in 2009, a guy named Thierry Koblenz wrote this wonderful article in the List Apart talking about how we can create videos in our flexible layouts that maintain intrinsic ratios. And his approach was actually kind of brilliant, because if you go to any video on any website, YouTube, the Do Lectures, what have you, we understand that it has certain characteristics, right? A width and a height set in pixels. But if we look past the pixels themselves, those two characteristics actually have a very deep and fundamental relationship to each other. More specifically, the aspect ratio, which we measure from one corner of this video down to its diagonal opposite. Now, the nice thing is that we can actually measure that aspect ratio with some very simple proportional math. We take the height, divide it against the width, and that leaves us with the aspect ratio. So if we were to plug in the pixels from this video here, we'd basically be left with an aspect ratio of roughly 56.25%, or in cinemaphile terms, about 16:9 aspect ratio. So what we're going to do with that math is we're going to sort of take that number and sort of put it in our back pockets for a second. And we're going to go to the HTML, and we're going to size that video down so it's maybe small screen friendly by default. And then we're going to wrap it with some sort of container element, like a div with the class of video box. Now, this doesn't look like much. But with these two components in place, what we can then do is write some kind of interesting CSS. So what we can do is on that containing element, we can apply a position of relative to it, and I'll return to that in a minute. And then we can also set a padding top of 56.25%. We're basically setting a padding top equal to the aspect ratio we just calculated. And so what that does inside that container is it creates a kind of ghost box up at the top. It creates a padding top that's going to be 56.25% as tall as the box is wide. This made no sense to me first when I read about this, but let me actually go into my browser, and I just rooted around in my browser's inspector, and I deleted the video entirely from its container. And I spent hours agonizing over that wonderful pink background color I applied to it. I hope you guys like it. In fact, there's no content whatsoever inside that containing element. The text that you see is just generated with some CSS. And I've only applied a background color and that padding top to it. But what you'll notice now is that when I resize the video, or when I resize the design, it maintains its aspect ratio. There's no content whatsoever within that element, but because of that padding top, it actually has an intrinsic relationship between its width and its height. I think this is pretty cool, but this is why I don't get out much. But this is just the stage, right? I mean, this is sort of the first step in our process to actually getting videos working in our responsive layouts. Because once we've done that, because we applied a position of relative to the container, what we can then do is take the video itself and position it absolutely within its containing element, top and left within that box. And then we can also set its width and its height to be 100% of the width and height of its containing element. So what we basically have done is we've taken that video and we've sort of stretched it like some saran wrap over that container that actually has an intrinsic ratio. So now I've gone back to my browser and I've reinstated the video, but I've removed all the JavaScript that was responsible for resizing it before. And now what we have is a completely responsive video, and the effect is so much smoother. We've removed a layer of complexity, but we actually have a net effect for the end user that's dramatically better. It's a little bit different, a little bit lazier, I might say, but we've actually improved the experience in the long run. So this, at least for me, from a front-end development standpoint, is really what I'm thinking about from a laziness standpoint. Looking for opportunities to do just a little bit less, and yet maybe achieve a little bit more. And this has definitely been true for a lot of the larger layout systems that I've been working on in recent months. So I run a podcast with a colleague of mine, Karen McGrain, where we talk to companies who have actually implemented large-scale responsive redesigns. And I actually had some fun with this index page that showed all of our episodes. I sort of redesigned it, basically give a little bit more information to give a greater sense of breadth of what we were actually designing and publishing, excuse me. So on this index page, which is completely responsive, otherwise the domain name would be kind of unfortunate, I guess. This is basically sort of built off of the three main ingredients of a responsive layout. Excuse me. So every responsive design basically begins with some sort of flexible grid. And so the building blocks for this layout, we're going to look at these individual cells and apply some very simple layout math, right? I'm going to float all these elements to the left, I'm going to apply some gutters to them, and then give them all a width of roughly 30%, so they are all roughly a third of the row. Except this isn't quite everything, because there's two components missing to build a complete three-column grid. The first thing that I would need to do would actually be to make sure that that first cell in each row clears all the floats preceding it, to make sure that it's starting a row rather than just sort of extending it infinitely. And then the last thing that I need to do is actually remove that right-hand margin from the last cell in each row in order to make sure that it's flush against the edge of the design. Now, in the olden days, like last year, I guess, I would have to go into my HTML and actually apply some extra information into the layout to actually describe those cells so that I could then address them in the CSS, to say that this is the first cell and this is the last cell in each row. But the thing is that we're actually being given some tools now to actually do so much more by removing that prescriptive HTML and talk to them directly in CSS. Tools like nth child, for example, which allow us to directly address individual parts of our design without actually having to describe them in our markup. So, for example, I could say something like episode nth child 2 to directly address that second episode, that's the second child of its parent, and apply some styles to it and to it alone. This is completely useless. Where nth child actually gets kind of interesting, however, is when you say something like nth child 2n. What this allows you to do is basically select every even-numbered cell in this grid immediately with one single CSS selector. Now this works because n is basically a counter. It starts from 0 and increments by 1 each time. So in other words, this is simple multiplication. 2 times 0, 2 times 1, 2 times 2, and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter if there are 20 cells in this grid or 20,000. Every even-numbered cell in this grid is going to have these styles applied to it. So this is, again, not super useful, but where we can actually build our three-column layout is by saying something like nth child 3n to address the third cell, every third cell, and remove that right-hand margin to make sure that it's flush against the edge of the design. And then I can also say 3n plus 1 to select every third cell, but this time starting from 1 rather than 0. So we'll select the first cell, the fourth cell, the seventh cell, and so on and so forth, ensuring that they clear all the floats preceding it and make sure that every single row has a nice discrete grouping of 3. So this is the net result. We have a little bit of proportional math and some lightweight CSS to basically build this flexible layout. The proportions will change over time, or the pixels will change over time, but the proportions remain intact. So this laziness is actually really valuable when you're building more complex layouts. And so when I was actually making this flexible grid responsive, that flexibility actually came really into play. So every responsive design I've started working on over the last couple years has begun with this sort of baseline design. It's a mobile-friendly layout by default. It's a single column of tasks and information basically stacked on top of each other. Outside of the media queries, there's really not much in the way of layout. But then as I widen the design a little bit more, I can use media queries to actually articulate how the design needs to adapt at certain breakpoints. So at a width of around 44 ems, for example, I can move to a 2-column layout. And I'm doing so by using an nth child 2n and 2n plus 1, sort of similar to what we did before. And then I can widen the layout a little bit more and look for another opportunity to enhance itself. So at a breakpoint of around 70 ems or 69 ems, I can use nth child 3n and 3n plus 1 to go back up to that 3-column layout. So I think you can see where this is going. Because we actually haven't described the layout in our HTML, we can just at the different breakpoints introduce simple selectors to introduce a 4th-column layout. Or maybe as things get a little bit wider still, introduce a 5-column layout. We're at this point now where we can design flexible, responsive design systems that are effectively infinite. You know, responsive design for me isn't about taking widescreen friendly designs and shrinking them down to smaller screens, although that's definitely a great use case. It's about acknowledging the fact that there's no one ideal layout for our work. We can design experiences that are incredibly compelling on the smallest screen or on the widest one possible. You're really only constrained by the amount of time and resources you want to spend on building these systems, and I fully admit I spend entirely too much on this one. But if you can actually release the need to control your markup to that degree and describe your layout, you're actually given considerably more flexibility in the long run. So this might actually be a good time to talk a little bit about the F word, specifically frameworks. So I use front-end frameworks very frequently in my work. These are sort of third-party patterns, usually off-the-shelf CSS and HTML patterns that allow us to describe layouts very quickly, usually by articulating how the grids are actually composed, where they sit in a row, the number of columns they span, and so forth. And these are wonderful resources, just to be clear. They're fantastic for prototyping, for getting ideas into browsers as quickly as possible. In team-based environments, there can be a lot of benefit derived from actually removing some of the ambiguity out of building layouts. And especially for learning as well. I mean, if somebody's just getting into the fundamentals of page layout or responsive design, these are fantastic. But they feel kind of heavy to me. And I don't just mean heavy from a performance standpoint, with all the extra code that they actually require. I mean, they kind of feel conceptually heavy to me, and for a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, they're still very much built around this idea of a page, that there's some sort of ideal grid, usually a 12 or 16 column grid that's desktop appropriate, and then articulating in the HTML how and when they need to change to make them accessible to smaller screens. And with all the new devices classes that we have to support today, much less in 2 years' time, this doesn't feel like it's going to scale very well for us in the long run. There was a wonderful video that sort of showed up recently. I mean, there are all these wonderful browsers, WebKit-based browsers available for Android Wear out today. And this is a great video of somebody actually browsing through the responsive TechCrunch site. And this device didn't actually exist when TechCrunch launched its redesign, but this is a great example of designing for flexibility from the outset. And so this is why, at least for me, thinking about our layouts in terms of columns and classes and how they need to change at specific breakpoints doesn't feel like it's a long-term game we're going to win. I've been actually doing a lot of reading and research recently about the early days of animation, right, where we had people like Winsor McKay and Max Fleischer who were really at the forefront of designing what this medium could actually be. They were some of the first people to put pen to paper and make those drawings move. And their work is technically and visually stunning, but I also think it's fair to say that it looks very much like it's of its time, right? I mean, there's something in their motion that doesn't quite feel human. It feels a little bit too mechanical. Now, part of this is because they didn't have the benefit of working at a time when they could sort of sit back and talk about design and best practices in animation, right? I mean, they were really trying to figure out what this medium could be. But it wasn't until Walt Disney actually came along that people sat up and took animation seriously, not just as a novelty, but as an art form. Because the effect that his studio's work had on the marketplace really can't be understated. Because he took some incredibly spare, incredibly simple drawings, but once they were colored and animated, they felt real. They felt human. There's this line that I love by one of Disney's original animators, Mark Davis, who said that prior to Disney's studio, animation had been done before, but stories were never told. Now that is some powerful mic dropping on pretty much every one of your predecessors and all of your competitors, right? But I mean, on some level, it's really kind of true. Because again, Disney's drawings weren't necessarily more technically competent than most of his competitors. And in many cases, they were actually inferior. But when they came to life, their movements felt human, audiences could actually see themselves in these drawings for the very first time. There's something incredibly fundamental about that. Now, this wasn't because Disney himself was like an incredibly talented illustrator, although he hired some of the very best. He was, however, an incredibly exacting director. And he demanded of his staff that they produce drawings that had what he called a caricature of realism, an illusion of life. And I love that line. And in fact, it became the title of one of my favorite books, The Illusion of Life, by two of Disney's original animators, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend checking it out, especially for a technical book. It's very funny, it's very approachable. It's a beautiful piece of work. But as you're actually leafing through this book, you know, Thomas and Johnston were actually trying to articulate how it was that Disney was actually able to produce these beautiful pieces of work as a studio. And the cornerstone of the book is they distilled their process down to what are now known as the 12 basic principles of animation. Now, these were actually adapted recently into a sort of an animated format, and I thought I'd just play a little bit for you today.
The following has been paraphrased from The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Squash and stretch. This action gives the illusion of weight and volume to a character as it moves. Anticipation. Prepares the audience for a major action the character is about to perform. Each major action is preceded with specific moves that anticipate for the audience what is about to happen. Staging. It's the presentation of an idea so that it is clear.
Anyway, just a short excerpt. It's a really great little video. And in fairness to the original book, this is more of a paraphrase than anything else. There's some things they don't quite get right. But it's a really great example of what it was that Disney and his team thought of when they were thinking about design principles from the outset. In other words, this allowed them to talk about the quality of their work as it was evolving and to see whether or not it was actually measuring up to Disney's edict that their work actually had to have that illusion of life, that caricature of realism. Did a character's arm have enough squash and stretch as it was about to throw a ball? Or before it even took that action, did it properly stage the action that was about to occur? In other words, these principles, make no mistake, were a framework. But not a framework in the web sense, talking about the specific checklist of items that they had to include to basically make sure that this was a quote-unquote Disney film. But this is a shared vocabulary, a shared set of values that they could use to talk about the quality of the execution, independent of the layout or the coloring or the drawing itself. So in other words, this is a philosophical framework. And I wonder if now, today, with all the challenges that we have in front of us, maybe we need something similar. Maybe we need a similarly nimble framework as well. Somewhere where we're focused less on layout and interaction, but actually talking more broadly about the quality of our work as it's evolving. Because there are actually a lot of really great examples of this throughout every sort of design medium. Graphic design is no exception. Recently, the Whitney Museum actually redesigned and rebranded itself, and they came up with this wonderful logo system that they call the responsive W. And then the designers spent literally 3 paragraphs explaining how this had nothing whatsoever to do with responsive design, which was some cute interaction thing. But this is a really beautiful piece of work. It's incredibly simple, it's incredibly minimalist, but it's also really versatile. You know, because this design system could actually incorporate pieces of artwork from the museum to talk about upcoming exhibits. It could also be encountered at different points of the user's day, maybe in the physical world or in the digital one. And at least for me, when I'm looking at all these dozens, if not hundreds of different applications for the logo, you know, you'd be forgiven to think that there's like a computer sort of chugging away in a closet somewhere, churning out all these different variations, right? I've never actually seen a computer before. But actually, they came up with a very lightweight framework that gave them infinite amounts of flexibility. Because what they said was that given a certain size of media, a certain piece of paper, a certain part of the screen, you understood that there were certain fixed elements that you had to incorporate for this specific application. And so given that, to design this logo, it was just a matter of taking the available space remaining and divide it into 4 equal quadrants. And then it's just a simple matter of connecting the dots. The top of one line to the bottom of the next, top of the next, and so on until you have your responsive W completed. So at least for me, I've been sort of throwing a lot of shade at graphic design in recent years, especially we've been talking about moving past the page. But these problems of adapting work to different media is something that print designers have been dealing with for centuries, decades. Carl Gerstner, who's a Swiss designer in the middle of the 20th century, spent a considerable amount of time thinking about this problem in particular and how frameworks were the way out. And he basically came up with this idea that design systems were really where designers should be focusing their time rather than on the media and the layout system specifically. Now, he came up with something that he called the morphological typogram, which suggests to me that Mr. Gershner was incredibly fun at parties. But this is a really great framework that allowed him, as he was doing branding work, to quickly iterate over different variations to see what was actually worth investing more time in. So given any kind of logo that he might be designing, he would basically say that it had 4 characteristics: basis, color, appearance, and expression. And then each one of those characteristics could be then subdivided into some sort of subcategories, and then each one would then have potential outcomes sort of listed off to the right. Now this looks like tons of fun to work with, right? But what it allowed Mr. Gershner to do is actually look at each one of those individual characteristics and choose interesting combinations from the outset, so that he could come up with word marks that would sort of score along individual sections and then sort of quickly iterate over different ones. So in other words, he could iterate quickly, discard what wasn't working, and hone in on combinations that felt successful for him and that client. All because he invested in the framework first, and then the implementation afterwards. And he has this quote that I love, that instead of solutions for problems, we should instead be designing systems to support further solutions. For no problem is there an absolute solution. There is always a group of solutions, one of which is the best under certain conditions. In other words, I think that the vocabulary we develop to talk about the quality of our responsive designs is in many ways more important than the layouts themselves. And there's been a lot of work sort of in this area recently. Nathan Ford wrote this wonderful article for Listapart talking about this content out layout, thinking about designing these small systems and then building wider layouts to sort of support them from there. And in it, he actually talked about how it's valuable to borrow some terms from graphic design to talk about when individual elements don't seem to be effectively resizing themselves. 3 of my favorite words happen to be keynote, quit unexpectedly, in case you were wondering. Okay. So he argued, among many other things, that we should be investing not just in sort of these grid systems that are just like an even set of 12 or 16 uniform columns, but we can actually introduce asymmetric grids, introduce ratios into our design to give a little bit of jagged rhythm as we're reading from one end of the design to the other. But he also suggested that there are some terms from the printed page that we could use to talk about when items need to adapt. So for example, sevens, when there are unsightly gaps underneath pieces of information when we move to a 2-column layout. So as an image is shortened as its width is scaled down and adjacent text is switched, there might be that unreadable measure sort of left in the side. And then there are drifts where items might be divorced from the item that they're actually associated with from a content standpoint. And then finally pinches where items actually approach to each other a little bit too closely. These kinds of words, this vocabulary, is actually very critical, not just for thinking about how to adapt our designs for different size screens, but actually designing for the needs of the content that we're actually working with. And then moving into ratios as well. This is a wonderful example of using the golden ratio to actually build a larger grid system and then using that to change and adapt the system over time. So in other words, these kinds of vocabulary lessons are going to be really helpful in terms of moving past flexible layouts and really actually thinking about not just how our designs need to fit on different size screens, but also how we can make it feel at home. If our responsive designs don't have an ideal width, if they're not designed primarily for desktop or for mobile or for tablet, but we can actually make an experience that actually feels bespoke and custom on those size screens, that's actually kind of powerful. So by letting go of that need to control our layouts and markup, we can actually free up some time to actually build more interesting solutions for some of these specific challenges. And I got to be honest with you guys, one of the biggest challenges out there from a responsive standpoint happens to be navigation, as you guys might very well know. And this is tough, right? I mean, but the nice thing is that there's actually a lot of active experimentation going into designing these responsive systems. This is 538.com. This is sort of a news and media information site. And they have a very interesting responsive layout. On the wide screen, they actually have these teases of content that appears within each section. But that's actually just a widescreen enhancement. Because on the lowest end, that navigation simplifies itself to a toggleable element that actually only shows the primary navigation. So those teases are seen as non-critical to the user. They're only sort of seen as an enhancement. This is coop.se. This is a beautiful e-commerce site. I highly recommend spending a little bit of time with it. I love their navigation system in particular because they've adopted what's known as a sort of off-canvas menu pattern, right? That the navigation is sort of like this element waiting in the wings, off to the left, waiting until the user's ready to invoke it. And then it slides in from the left to come into view. Another great example of this would be Walmart.ca. Walmart launched this responsive redesign last year, and while their navigation is visible by default on wider screens, below a certain point it goes to that off-canvas pattern. You tap or click on an element, and it slides in from off-canvas. So there's a lot of experimentation around designing responsive systems out there today. There is, however, one element that these examples in particular show, and I just want to sort of call your attention to it, which is your good friend and mine, the hamburger. Has anyone hamburgered their sites recently? Does anyone else miss the English language? So this wonderful sort of three-bar pattern is quickly becoming kind of a de facto state for responsive navigation systems or for mobile-specific navigation systems. And there's a lot of power to it, right? I mean, it's incredibly concise. It's only 3 simple bars. It's very easy to incorporate into our designs with some SVG icons or maybe a little bit of Unicode if you're feeling fancy. But after we've had a fair amount of healthy pizza tonight, I'm here tonight, guys, to maybe suggest to you that maybe our industry has just a little bit of a hamburger problem. It's really contentious, I understand, but moving past that. So, I mean, again, this is a wonderfully compact item. It actually scales incredibly well, which is, I think, half of its appeal, right? It can definitely fit into a larger, more complex layout fairly well. The thing is that this icon actually has a very distinct background. This is actually the Chinese trigram for sky, or heavens. And at least for me, this feels like a little bit of an arbitrary choice for tap on this element, and you'll get directions to our restaurant. Now, maybe that's okay. Again, you know, this is an element that's incredibly ubiquitous, and we can definitely sort of co-opt things respectfully from other contexts. But there's also some indications that this pattern, as widespread as it might be, may not necessarily be as successful for our users as we'd like. This is time.com. This is a beautiful responsive redesign. It's incredibly information dense, to be clear, but I also think they've done a really nice job making sure that it never feels overwhelming to the user. And they have a significant number of navigation tiers that they're juggling. And so they actually decided on the widescreen to actually hamburger themselves. And in the top left corner, the first time you come to the site, there's this helpful little overlay that says exactly what the hamburger does. The hamburger also has a label of menu, and if your device happens to have a mouse attached to it, you can hover over the hamburger, and it says click here to show site navigation. Now, I've never been especially good with math, but at least by my count, there's about 15 levels of help text with this one single icon, which this suggests to me, and I didn't work on this redesign, I'm not familiar with the team that did. This suggests to me a couple things. One is that stakeholders may not necessarily have been confident in this icon to clearly communicate itself to its audience, or maybe it didn't actually perform well in acceptance testing. This isn't necessarily a cautionary tale about hamburgers themselves, but more rather that if you're going to adopt any kind of iconography, it's worth testing thoroughly to make sure that it's actually successful for our users, because in other words, this could be a real single point of failure for your responsive navigation. But there are some other problems with our ability to conceal navigation, to sort of tuck it away until our users are ready to interact with it. This is Disney.com. And to be clear, this is one of my favorite responsive designs that's come out in recent years. It's a beautiful piece of work. And they've opted for the ubiquitous hamburger, as you can see on the top left. But you'll notice that as you move down to a smaller screen and you tap or click on that hamburger, that off-canvas menu is going to appear, and in it you're going to find every single link that's ever existed on the World Wide Web. If you were looking for that GeoCities page you designed in 1997, I think I saw it scurry past around tier 4 or 5. Now, I don't mean to pick on Disney. Again, this is a very, very well done piece of navigation, and the responsive design in general is very nicely executed. But I worry that because we have the ability to conceal our navigation systems, if we might be presenting our users with this immaculate, perfectly tailored first look of our responsive layouts, and then they tap on that hamburger, they open that closet door, and they find all the crap we didn't want to deal with in our responsive redesign. Now, in many ways, I think, especially when you're dealing with something as potentially politically contentious as a menu system, it's important to not avoid the hard stuff. For me, navigation is one of those key areas of a responsive design where we should really be thinking mobile first, right? We should be looking at that small screen as kind of an acid test for the value of our content. And if something doesn't fit on that smallest screen, then rather than just going to some interesting pattern that allows us to conceal it, maybe we should actually take that moment to pause and have a conversation about whether or not it's actually valuable to our end users. In other words, if a responsive designer can look for opportunities to simplify their designs before simply suppressing information, I think the end user is actually going to benefit regardless of the size of their screens. But the other thing about this pattern, and by defaulting to it, we're actually closing ourselves off to some interesting other alternatives. There are other responsive systems out there, like the BBC News, who just launched their responsive site worldwide. And they've adopted this pattern that I call kind of the progressive reveal, where they have this more link that they kind of treat as a drawer to progressively move elements down as the screen gets wider or smaller. So it's sort of a mid-tier. You can actually see these links actually getting demoted out of the primary navigation. And then below a certain point, they adopt a hamburger. So I think this is kind of a nice middle-tier approach. The Guardian have actually got a really interesting navigation system. It's sort of a variation on this progressive reveal approach. A colleague of mine calls this the rotating sushi conveyor belt. I'm not hungry or anything. So basically on any size screen, you can tap or click on that sections link to pull up this incredibly exhaustive sitemap of all the major sections of the Guardian's news site. But then basically the primary navigation is never actually concealed. So what they've done is at smaller breakpoints, they've actually turned it into sort of a scrollable area. So the primary links, the most popular sections, are actually sorted so that the most popular ones appear first, and then the rest are sort of treated in that overflow. Now the nice thing about this approach is that it works incredibly well on touch or on mouse-based displays. Again, if the design or if the device actually supports it, this is a really interesting approach. Just adapting the layout can also be incredibly powerful. And there are a couple examples of Filament Group, for example. This is a design firm here in Boston. So their responsive site, I think, is actually very beautiful. It's very spare and very open. But their primary navigation is actually treated as a first-class citizen on their homepage. It's actually important wayfinding, so it actually appears in the intro block. But then on content pages, where the actual article should be a focus, they've adopted that toggle-based pattern. So the nice thing about this approach is that it suggests, to me at least, that these patterns don't need to necessarily be universally applied. We can be a little bit more nuanced about how and when we apply them. Another real example of adapting the layout would be Frank Camaro's website. A beautiful piece of responsive design. I highly recommend checking it out. He does beautiful graphic design work, but his navigation is never hidden. And this is a lovely example of, this actually feels at home to me, regardless of how wide or small my screen happens to be, because of the amount of care he's actually spent in designing it as well. And part of this, if we're talking a little bit about laziness, the way that he's actually laid this out from a CSS standpoint couldn't be lazier. Because he's not actually floating these individual parts of his masthead around. He's simply saying that the containing element is now styled as a flexbox. This is a little bit of advanced CSS, but basically what it immediately does is it turns that logo tagline and the navigation into sort of two equal height columns that span the full width of the row. The nice thing about Flexbox is that, not that he'd want to do this, but he could, in theory, just sort of like change the direction of them, all by sort of just changing the characteristics of their container. And that's a little bit deep in the weeds. But basically, I think that we can look for these opportunities to be just a little bit lazier. Not just about CSS, but just because we have the ability to control navigation doesn't necessarily mean that we need to do so from the outset. In other words, I think laziness for me and a lot of patterns that I'm working on is about a conservation of effort. We have a significant number of challenges in front of us. From a device class standpoint, from an interaction standpoint, it's worth asking ourselves that maybe there are bigger and more interesting battles to fight. And at least in a lot of my recent work, some of that's come down to animation. Tell you a quick story. This is a circle I designed recently. Hold your applause. This is actually more a story about 4 circles I designed recently. I've been doing a lot of interactive work lately on web applications. I don't really know what a web application is, but I've been told I've been working on them. And so these tend to be highly transactional interfaces, right, that tend to have a significant number of choices that are presented to the user, often in sequence. But despite the fact that some of these interfaces might be a little bit drier, suspend the photos that I've actually slotted in here for a minute, there can still be fun interactions that we sort of invest in them to communicate state changes to the user in a pleasing way. So this is an example of one such interface that I worked on, this sort of 4-cross picker. And so we sort of arrived at this final design through a lot of paper prototyping, some comps being thrown back and forth, and eventually we sort of settled into this one animation workflow that we wanted to sort of introduce to the user when they were interacting with this element. Specifically that whenever you selected an element from this 4 across row, it would move into that second position. And then simultaneously, confirmation and cancel buttons would appear to allow the user to confirm or back out of that choice. And then there would be all that fancy animation stuff that the kids are talking about today. Now, the process for actually building something like this doesn't begin with the circles or with the animations themselves. Rather, it's about taking a step back and designing the transaction that we're building, not the interface. Rather than thinking about the individual layouts or the different devices we're going to be thinking about, it's really about looking at what we're asking the user to do and then supplying them with HTML to support that. So when I'm looking at something like this, it's tempting to look at this as, these are 4 elements arrayed in a row, and they're going to be shaped in this way, and the typography is going to look this way. But really what I'm talking about here is by asking the user to make a choice and then to confirm or back out of that choice. And because they can only choose one element at a time, what I'm really talking about here are a set of radio buttons. Each one of them with a label that contains the text and the image next to it. And then at the very bottom of the form, we're actually going to have a submit button labeled as OK, and then some sort of reset button to allow them to back out of the choice that they just made. So this doesn't look like too much, but this is the foundation for building a much more complicated responsive interface up from there. Because with this in place, we can, in certain qualified browsers, introduce some simple CSS to basically hide the radio buttons accessibly, to sort of remove them from view so the user only ever sees the image and the text. And then we can basically set those labels that are remaining to table cells so they basically occupy 25% of the row. And then we can round off all the elements that the user actually sees. And so basically with a little bit of extra styling, this is what we're left with. This more or less looks like what we want the user to interact with. It's not necessarily perfect. Things are laid out in two different rows, and it doesn't have that fun slidey bits, but just like the basic radio buttons, this is the foundation for the step that's going to follow it. Because what we can then do is in JavaScript, we're going to ask the browser a little bit of a question. Are you capable of handling more advanced animations? And if it passes the test, what we're then going to do is apply a class of hasAnimation to the HTML element. So if it passes that test, then we can really get things interesting. What we can then do is we can use some positioning to take those form buttons, the OK and cancel buttons, and actually position them up over the labels that the user is actually going to be interacting with. Now this is kind of broken, right, because 2 of the buttons are actually concealed. Because what we can then do is we can actually use some transforms in our CSS to shrink those elements down to be 0 pixels tall and 0 pixels high. We can turn off their opacity, and then we can actually use z-indexing to stack them underneath the labels that the users are interacting with. So we sort of had this like shrinking effect that we just wrote in our CSS. We actually want to reuse that for any element the user didn't interact with. And that's where this sort of gnarlier part of the CSS actually works with. And this looks pretty complicated, but basically all it's saying is, if the form has a class of selected, hide all the labels that aren't checked. And if it does, then those transforms and the opacity toggles are going to be applied and hide any element that the user didn't actually work with. So in other words, our JavaScript doesn't actually need to manage position or animation. All the JavaScript needs to do is notice when the user chooses an element and apply a class of selected to the form to signify some sort of state change, and then actually mark that label that the user chose as checked. So this is basically the 2 elements that we need to do to actually make this, this interaction work. And this is where some more complicated CSS sort of comes into play. We're going to define some transitions kind of at the top level. And then whenever a label has a class of checked, we're going to use translate transforms to slide it into that second position. Now, I wrote this, and I barely understand how it works. But basically, all we're doing is that in this sort of 4 cross row, we understand that that second position is the terminal position for anything the user selects. So those translate transforms are basically going to be sliding elements by units of 100% relative to the width of that element. So whenever I select an element, it's going to be basically have that class of checked applied to it, and it's going to use that translate transform to slide into that second position. And then whenever I hit the cancel button, all the classes get removed, and the form returns to its original state. So I realize because it's at the end of the day, and you guys had some tasty pizza before the meetup, I'm seeing some, maybe some shaking heads, some arms crossed. Maybe this feels like a little bit too much work. Because what I've asked you to do is actually start from some simple looking radio buttons, and then enhance them slightly so that aesthetically speaking, from a layout standpoint, they look a little bit closer to what we're trying to end up with. And then we end up with this final animated, refined interface. And at least this probably feels like the opposite of what we talked about in the beginning. That if anything, this is so not lazy. Always end with a GIF, Mom said. Mom never said that. But the thing is I would actually argue that by designing our interfaces in layers like this is actually the laziest way possible to build a digital interface today in 2015. Because a well-crafted responsive design has to be built from a device-agnostic standpoint, full stop. Now that phrase is kind of a loaded term and it sounds a little generic, but my friend Trent Walton wrote this wonderful essay about what that design principle means for him and his practice. Because basically making our layouts flexible is really the first step to making a truly device-agnostic responsive design. We're dealing with hostile browsers, with tiny screens, with slow connection speeds, with touch inputs. In other words, Trent basically said that there's more to devices than the size of their screens. A device-agnostic approach also takes into account infinite combinations of screen selection, input method, browser capability, and connection speed. Like cars designed to perform in extreme heat or on icy roads, websites should be built to face the reality of the web's inherent variability. I love that line. I wish I'd written it. Because I think that's true. Is that by designing interfaces that are actually built for that variability, that are hardened to deal with a web that's slower and more fragile than we might like to think, we can actually do some really wonderful things. What's more, that design principle has been at the heart of every major responsive design built at scale over the last couple years. And the BBC is actually a great example of this. Because if you visit their responsive site on any reasonably capable browser or device, you're going to see all these little UI niceties, right? Like expandable menus that show links in place, tabs that toggle different kinds of content. Even the secondary stories have images associated with them. But those are all characteristics of just one view of this responsive design. Because if you view this design under certain conditions, with a slightly older device or slightly older browser, you're still going to be left with a completely flexible, responsive design, but it's going to act and function just a little bit differently. Those expandable menus will actually just be skip links that bring you to the bottom of the page where the menus reside by default. Those tabs are actually just regular links that bring you to separate pages entirely where the content resides natively. And those secondary stories don't actually have images associated with them. Those are seen as enhancements, not core to the underlying experience. So what the BBC have done, in other words, they've started with this baseline fundamental design that's completely responsive, that they serve universally, and then conditionally enhance it up to something a little bit more enhanced, something a little bit more refined if your browser can actually benefit from it. Now the process that they use to decide which version your browser actually benefits from is this technique that they call cutting the mustard, which is my new favorite phrase ever. Does your browser cut the mustard, sir? So basically all they're doing is loading just enough code in the design to see if your browser can then handle more code. So inline in the head of their page, they basically have a little bit of JavaScript that just looks for specific browser features. And those taken together are hallmarks of a sufficiently modern browser that will benefit from that more refined experience. And if it passes that test, then great. All the extra CSS and JavaScript that powers that more refined experience gets pulled in, but if it doesn't, that's great. You're left with a completely responsive and completely fast and accessible design at the end of the day. What this means for the BBC, in other words, is that they don't have to manage individual platform and browser combinations, although I'm sure they do to a certain extent. They can instead think about their design as existing in one of two incredibly broad experience tiers. In other words, designing for progressive enhancement, for designing from a device-agnostic standpoint, is one of the laziest ways you can design for an incredibly broad audience. And I applaud them for it. So just to wrap things up, because I know it's late and I've really appreciated your time tonight, the web is everywhere. The web is every size. The web is accessed at any point in our users' days. And this is the challenge facing our work, and will continue to be for quite some time. And I firmly believe that third-party patterns and frameworks are absolutely going to be part of that solution, but I also think it's worth remembering that those third-party approaches are in many ways a snapshot of the web as we understand it right now, today. There's this concept in Buddhism of this notion of the beginner's mind, that when you're approaching a problem, even if it's one you've encountered before, you should approach it with questions rather than answers. even something that you've dealt with before, you should basically be looking at the world with eagerness and with a lack of preconceptions, essentially approaching things as a beginner. And I don't know about you, but in talking with some of you guys and hearing some of the projects that you've been working on and speaking with the BostonCHI board, I definitely feel very much like a beginner. And it's been a real honor to be part of the evening tonight. So I release you into the evening, into the heart of Cambridge. But just before you go, I'd like to actually remember there can be value at times in doing less. And sometimes it's going to allow us to do significantly more. So in other words, go forth and just be a little bit lazy from time to time. Thank you very much. So it's a little warm in here, don't you think? Should we? I opened the doors. I can't find. Sure. I'm just wondering if you guys want to do Q&A. Maybe we should adjourn to the hallway. Maybe it'd be a little cooler out there, or we can chat in here. I'm around for a while. Oh, video. There's video. Okay, let's chat here. Thanks, David. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Oh.
I have your original version of your book, Responsive Web Design, and I just got the second edition, and I'm assuming there'd just be mostly, from what I read, corrections, better diagrams, and so forth. How much of this information is in that book, if any?
It's a great question. Thank you. I'm actually working on a new book right now that is going to be dealing with a lot more of these specific design challenges. So the first book, for those of you who haven't suffered through it, is really about kind of building these larger layout systems and thinking about how to design them responsibly. And the next book, the sort of Empire Strikes Back version, is really about looking at the individual challenges inside those larger responsive grids. So there's some hints of this in here, some of the progressive enhancement stuff specifically, but the book is definitely, there's a lot of corrections, a lot of things fixed. There's some things added as well, but it's really about those larger challenges. So thank you. It's a great question. Yes, right here. Yeah. How to handle rags. So rags, I mean, like from a typographic standpoint specifically, I mean, that's one of those things that I don't think there's like a wonderful solution for, generally speaking. I mean, clamps would be another thing that I'd love to be able to introduce as well. I think, there's some basic justification options in CSS that allow us to sort of control some of that, but end of the day, I mean, just given the variability of not just of the columns that we're designing, but the churn of the content that could be published in those columns, that might be something where I'd sort of like look to see if there are any sort of like third-party libraries out there, but I haven't found a really great solution yet. So, sorry. And did you have a question? Yeah.
So device-agnostic sounds awesome. How do you get your development team to buy into building you that basic one that'll run on all the browsers and not just say, all right, it's done, let's release it and call it a day, and then build the nicer version to run on a more modern browser?
Sure. No, that's a wonderful question. So the question was, thinking about device agnosticism and progressive enhancement, like how do you actually make that case internally? The nice thing is that there are a number of organizations that have been talking about, from a financial standpoint, the money that saved them. The BBC and The Guardian would be two great examples of that. And there was another example recently, but I'm blanking on it. But you can absolutely, from like an MVP standpoint, sort of refine, like just release that more refined version and then kind of go back and bolt in that kind of progressive enhancement approach. That's always going to be significantly more expensive. I've worked on some products that really just thought about JavaScript only experiences and then kind of wanted to go back and kind of like sort of fill that in. But if you can begin with that approach of not relying on your code, not relying on your JavaScript reaching the end user, that actually simplifies a significant amount from an implementation standpoint. So I'd be happy to share some resources with you offline a little bit more, but there's been a lot of writing about that. Yeah, so anyway. Yeah. I think the NSA is trying to dial in or something, but yeah, so there's been some literature out there. I'd be happy to share some with you. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Hey, Steve. Sure. Yeah. Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely talk a little bit more about that. So the book's in editing right now. It's hopefully coming out later this year. And it's really talking about some of these specific problems in more detail, like navigation's a good example. Responsive advertising is another big challenge that I hear from on a lot of my projects. It's talking a little bit more not just about how and why these things need to adapt, but also some of the guiding design principles behind them. So hopefully giving organizations a little bit more of a vocabulary to talk about, not just how we sort of solve this problem, but why we might want to solve this problem. So, yeah, that's the 50 words or less version, I guess. Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that. In the back, yes. Hi. Yeah, no, I think Bootstrap and Foundation are actually, those are two tools that I use frequently in my work, mainly from a prototyping standpoint. I tend to not, at least in my practice, sort of like, those aren't usually something that's a client-facing deliverable, just for some of the reasons I outlined tonight. That said, I mean, there are a number of organizations out there that really invest heavily in them. I think Foundation is actually really well engineered. I haven't worked with Bootstrap in a few years now, but they're really focused on that sort of mobile-first approach and thinking about how it needs to enhance up from there. Yeah, that's sort of the best I got. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Hi. Yeah. Sure. Yep. Sure. Yep. No, absolutely. The nice thing is that there are a number of really great prototyping tools out there. Balsamic is one that I know a lot of organizations are really big into. There's another one, new one called Weld, Weld.io, I think. They're a little bit more visually oriented, so you can sort of think about like how to sketch out an adaptive, responsive layout and talk a little bit more about content hierarchy independent of, sort of HTML and CSS. I'd be happy to share some links with you offline or maybe with Bill, but yeah, there are a lot of great UIs out there to work with. Yeah, thank you. Hi. Sure. Okay. Mm. Oh, interesting. Okay. Sure. I haven't come across that research in my own work. I've designed systems that can be reoriented from one to the other. This is one of those areas where I usually advise clients to think, like I was mentioning, the BBC with that baseline approach. They thought about the fact that their navigation follows their content independent of the richer interface, and so that's kind of how things are structured. I've found that doing that allows you to, as screens get wider or as devices get more complex, it gives you a lot more flexibility with moving things around kind of independent of the rest of the layout. So you can use some simple CSS to say, take something out of the bottom of the page and shoot it up to the top. So there might be some avenues to explore there with just kind of prototyping some of those approaches and then getting them in front of actual users. I've not encountered a design system that was intuitively better on the bottom on specific device classes. Yeah. Oh, sure. Right. Right. Yeah. 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 No, it's a big challenge, and I don't think anybody's nailed it. I've talked to some clients that actually they've looked for opportunities to kind of expose some of those decisions to the user. So looking, so maybe somebody's more comfortable holding a device in a certain way that's going to make it easier to access the top of the screen versus the bottom. There's no great way I've found to kind of intuit what the user prefers from the shape of the viewport. So for a system like that, maybe inviting the user into that might be kind of interesting. Default to one approach that feels right to you and the organization, but maybe allow the user to override that. Yeah. I'm excited to see what you come up with. Any other questions? Oh, yes. Hi. Sorry, one more time? Oh, the units in CSS. So viewport width and viewport height are two new units in CSS that basically allow you to draw elements proportional to the size of the screen, the viewport specifically. So 1 VH is basically 1% of the viewport's height. I've been using them a little bit to create like more vertical rhythm in design, so like trying to have some vertical rhythm around elements that's sensitive to the height of the viewport. That's something that I try to introduce with a fallback because support's so new in different devices and browsers, but I think they're wonderful, wonderful tools, definitely. Yeah. Is there a hand up over here? Yes, in the back. Thank you. We could have called, yeah. Yeah, so preprocessors like SAS or less are great. I've used them on specific projects. I don't default to using them too much. SAS I've used on a few projects more for like organizational. Yeah, I mean, I think they're wonderful tools. But yeah, personally, I just sort of use SAS to sort of break things up into like more modular-driven style sheets or something like that. I don't use a lot of heavy mix-ins or anything like that. But yeah, I think they're great. Thumbs up. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, everyone. It's been a real honor.